Hello there, welcome to Sudhakar Art and Photography. If you always wanted to learn painting, you're in the right place, because in this video I cover the fundamentals of watercolor painting, the basics that you need to master before you start your journey of being a student of art. Why watercolor? Because that's the best medium for beginners. It's non-toxic, it's very easy to get hold of, it's very inexpensive, and you can easily master the lights and shades with watercolor. So welcome to this first tutorial. Right, let's start off with materials first. Materials are extremely important, because if you don't start off with the right materials, you're not going to get the expected results from your work. First of all, paper. I've stuck a sheet on this board here. As you can see here, I've used scotch tape to stick the four ends. Ideally, you shouldn't be using scotch tape. You should be using the masking tape. At the moment I've run out of stock, so I've used this, but maybe in the next tutorial I'll show the masking tape. Now this is how the paper looks. It's thick, it's got a rough surface, it's manufactured specifically for watercolor paintings. If you use the printer paper, the standard printer paper that you use for printing out material or for writing, then you're going to have problems, because that paper is going to get wet, and it's going to bulge on the other side, and you're not going to get expected results. So paper, watercolor paper first of all. Secondly, the paint itself. Now you can buy any decent brand. I'd suggest a kind of a mid-range quality if you're a beginner, with at least the basic colors. Now this one's got a lot more colors in it, so I don't have to mix colors. So yeah, any decent brand of paint is good enough. Now these boxes come with brushes in them, and these two appear to be okay, but honestly I wouldn't be using these brushes. So let me show you the brushes I'm going to use. Here's a full range of brushes that I have with me. Now this is meant for both acrylic and for watercolor. To start with, maybe you don't need this entire range of brush. Starts with a 2-inch brush, and then you have the smaller brushes as well, and then you have one fan brush also. So if you want, you can get one of these. If you think painting is for you and you're serious about it, then you can get hold of one of these. If not, you can at least get one big brush, maybe let me show you the entire range. One big brush, a 2-inch brush, if not at least a 1-inch brush. Then you can get this standard brush, which has got a thick edge, and then you can also draw thin lines with this towards the tip of the brush. And then you can pick up some smaller brushes, thinner brushes, like maybe 1 or 2 of these. Take this out. Yeah, maybe one of these, and a thinner brush if you can get one. That should serve your purpose. I'll keep this away. And of course, watercolor can never be done without water. So here you need a couple of cups of clean water, tap water. Now it's important to have 2 bowls of these. One you'll be using for the soiled brushes, because one of these is going to take all the colors and it's going to look dark when you start painting. So you dip your brush in the colored water first, the apparently dirty water, and then clean it in the clean water. So 2 bowls of water are important. Keep that aside. That's your basic materials that you need before you start off. Now let's look at the fundamentals, the techniques that you need to understand, practice and master before you start painting landscapes. Right, so for the first technique that we need to understand in watercolor is the wet on wet technique. So for that, I've taken here the 1-inch brush, and I'm going to just apply some water on the surface of the paper. So not too much, just to make it decently wet. Now on top of this, as the name suggests, I'm going to use some paint here. I've got a fairly decent quantity of paint on my brush, which I'm going to spread on the surface of the paper. As you can see, the paint readily spreads through the wet surface. And you now have a fairly decently spread out surface, blue surface, which obviously can be used like the sky, for example. I can add additional colors to this if I want to create effect. It just depends on the kind of painting and the kind of requirement I have. So as you can see here, I've added 2 blues to this, and it's just spreading on the surface of the paper. That's the wet on wet, obviously used for textures like the sky, the clouds, and all of that. Now we can see the wet on dry. So I'm going to take some paint, apply it on the paper like this. So this is basically the paint on a dry surface. So it's wet on dry. But where this becomes useful is when you need to create some textures. For example, when I want to draw some clouds in the sky, I can hold the brush horizontally. As you can see here, this is the way I'm holding it, and I'm just rubbing the surface on the paper, and you can see what kind of a texture it creates on the paper. Now this is going to be useful in certain situations when I need this kind of a texture. This is wet paint on a dry surface, so it's called wet on dry. Now this surface is now beginning to be dry, but I think I'll have to wait for it to dry. So one of the tips I can give you is, if you want to quickly dry the surface, you can use one of these, your regular head dryer. Just plug it in and just blow the hot air on it, and it'll quickly get dry. If you want to save time, use one of these. Right, so I think the surface is fairly dry. So what I'm going to do is use a darker blue. So if you want to create the texture that I just showed you, make sure you have the right quantity of water. If you have too much of water, it'll look something like this. We don't want that. We want to get a texture that looks like something like this, something like this here. So use the right quantity of water, and then spread the brush like I showed you, horizontally. Don't press it too hard, but as you can see here, it creates the right texture for the sky. So you're basically now using the wet on dry technique on a dried surface, a colored dry surface, to create the effect that we just talked about, the texture that we talked about. So you've seen 2 techniques now, the wet on wet, the wet on dry surface. What we'll see next is dry paint, meaning not exactly dry but thick paint on an already dry colored surface, and the effect that can create. Let's say you have a green surface in the background here, and I can do some strokes like these to create leaves. I can use the same to create grass surface like this. This is thick paint on a dry surface. So I can draw some grass like this. I can also use it to draw branches. So let's say I'm drawing a tree and I want to draw some branches here. So I can use the thick paint, draw the trunk of a tree like this, and then use thick paint, like dab it well, make it thick, and gently go through this to draw the leaves, the stems on which you can then apply paint and create leaves. So here you go, you can create quite thin lines to create this effect, as you can see here. So the dry on dry, as I want to call it, I have no other name to call it. It's basically thick paint on a dry surface. You can use it for drawing leaves, grass and stems. One other thing I wanted to show with watercolor is that if you apply water in an area and then apply a watercolor on it, it stays within that area. Let me demonstrate that to you. So let's say we draw a circle here. What I'm going to do is to apply some paint in this area, some water in this area. So I'll just clean my brush and just a brief amount of water here into this circle. As you can see here, I will now apply some paint, and you'll notice that if you want to keep this paint within this circle, it remains within the area where you have applied water, so it actually doesn't go out. So this is good in keeping the borders clean. Where is this going to be useful? Let me just show you that. Let's say I want to draw some hills in this area. So imagine this is the sky. Let me draw some hills here, and I don't want the color of those hills to spread into the sky. So what do I do for that? I draw the outline with water. So this is where my sky is going to be. Ending into the mountain, I shall mix some sap green with some blue and try to get a light shade there. So this is where my hills are going to be. As you can see, it doesn't go beyond the area where I've applied water. Let me show that once again. So I'm going to mix some cobalt blue with some sap green, and there's sufficient water. This is dilute. So this is my area of the hill here, and if I make this area wet and I apply some mix of blue and green or whatever the color I want to use here, and I just apply it here, it stays within that area, so it's not going to go outside the area where I've applied the water. So it's going to be exactly where the border has been defined, so it won't spill into the sky. So watercolor has that property of remaining inside the area of water. That's what I'm trying to show here. One other property of watercolor is that it can spread into the area of water. So let me show you that. Now I'm applying water in this area. Now I'm going to take a little bit of gray and I'm going to touch it here. As you can see how it kind of magically spreads into the water here. So you can use this if you want to show some gray clouds in the sky, rain clouds somewhere beyond the hills. So the thick paint that I applied just flows into the water here. So it has a tendency, basically watercolor has this tendency to flow into the area of water, and if you apply water and then apply paint over it, it stays within that area of water like I showed here. Right now, one of the last tips that I want to show is about using pencil. In this example here, I drew a circle with a pencil and I applied paint, but unfortunately you can see that circle there. So as beginners, when we draw landscapes, we use pencils extensively to mark the borders or draw the trees, but you have to be very careful to make sure the pencil markings are not visible. This is because graphite is not soluble in water, and therefore it can shine through the paint, and that can spoil the look of the painting. So what you will need to do is by all means use a pencil and probably draw the outline, but use an eraser to just rub it off and keep it to the bare minimum. So that way your outline will be visible, but it's not going to look obvious. So you can see the difference between the circle here, which is hardly visible, to the circle here where you can actually see the pencil marking. So we don't want this. We want it to look like this to make it look more natural. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you found those fundamentals and tips and tricks useful. This is the first tutorial. In the next tutorial, we will jointly do a nice landscape using watercolor. So join me for the next video, but be sure to subscribe and click on the bell icon because you need to be notified when that video is being